I want to deal with a very specific question now, and that is how long can your questionnaire actually be? How many instruments can you include in it? Now let's make a quick calculation, which is also important to do to formulate your research question. You don't want to have a research question that's overly complex that you cannot possibly measure, right? So what is the bottleneck in a survey? What is the limiting factor? It's the attention span of your participants. Of course, this depends a lot on whom you're asking, whether you have a survey for 5-year-old children, whether it is for seniors who probably have a lot of more time, whether it's about executives who really want to get over it as soon as possible. And the reason why it is so important to actually consider that well is that your respondents always have the option to drop out of the questionnaire. And that is really the one thing that you do not want them to do. So let's be respectful of people's time. That means we only ask for things that really interest us and for which we have a clear plan of how to use them in analysis. And that means we do not ask for anything else. This question that we're answering here also has an implication for our overall model and our research question, as I said, because our model cannot be infinitely large, because you need to test every part of that model and need to ask for every concept in that model. This might be limited by logistics as well. So once we have done the calculation, I would ask you to go back to your original model to see whether this is actually okay and feasible. So let's do first things first. Now, what is a reasonable time to expect a respondent to work on your questionnaire? Well, I'll go for 10 minutes. It can be larger, it can be less, but because some are really willing to spend more time on that. But my experience is that the 10 minutes is quite a good idea, a quite good starting point to have in your head. So how many questions does that translate into? How many questions can you answer actually in 10 minutes? Well, that of course again depends on the type of question. There are basically two things that you need to think about. One is the complexity of the question. That also means language-related issues. How complex did you actually write it? Is it easy to understand? For this calculation here, I assume that they're easy to understand because that's what we usually go for. So that's why we are testing our instrument first. We really want to have a clear question. And the second thing, of course, is related to how much people know about it. For instance, if I ask you about your age, then you do not need to think a lot about it. But if I asked you about the attitude about some product, then you really need some more cognitive power to actually process that. That is extremely important to consider. We want to make everything as simple as possible. So that is the second point that is important in terms of how complex your questionnaire is perceived. If I have an open question, for instance, this can take quite a long time to actually fill in. And that's also the reason why hardly anybody actually fills out open-ended questions. So tip number 1, do not use any open-ended questions, except maybe for an open feedback box at the end. People usually do not fill it out, so it's not really useful to ask for it. Also, you will get the data in a very unstructured format, and it is not always clear what to do with it. And as I mentioned beforehand, only include questions where you have a clear plan of what to do with them. I'm assuming closed questions here that are clearly formulated for the rest of the calculation. So how many questions can you answer? My experience would be somewhere around 80 to 100 items within 10 minutes. That does sound a lot in the beginning, but it's actually not if you think more about it, because what we have discussed before is that it's always think in scales. So for one concept that you're testing, you'll have quite a few items that will help to measure that concept. For instance, if you have a personality scale, that scale alone could already take up 50 or 60 items, maybe even more. So that, of course, then becomes a problem because there is a very limited space that you still have available thinking about concepts. But so that is why I think it's so helpful to think about this beforehand so that you can prioritize your concepts. Also factor in that you will have some demographic variables to be asked in the questionnaire, say 5 to 10. Your effective space for any model testing will be around, 70 to 80 items, I would say. So take those questionnaires that you want to use, subtract this number from 80 and see how much space is left. Do you have space for one more? Well, then do so. If there's no space available, you can check if a short form of a questionnaire exists. That's often the case, because if you do have a precise measurement of personality, for instance, it would be quite inconvenient to use it in research, because it eats up so many resources. So often what researchers do is they develop a short form of the questionnaire which isn't as precise, but which is sufficiently precise and valid and reliable to be used in your thesis, for example. You can try to find such scales, just really search for short forms of whatever measurement instrument you want to use.